Welcome, everyone. This is Mintel's Little Conversation podcast, where we give you actionable insights backed by data. I'm Lynn Dornblaser. I'm a client advisor here at Mintel, and today we are talking about our 2025 food and drink trends. I'm joined by two of our experts. We've got Jenny Zegler, who is the director of Mintel Food and Drink, and we also have David Jago, who's a principal consultant. Jenny is based here in Chicago, like I am. Dave is based in our headquarters in London. So welcome, Jenny and Dave. It's good to have you here talking about 2025 trends.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
So, Jenny, do you want to kick us off since you've been so involved in creating our trends for ever now, it seems like, for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about how this works, about how Mintel comes up with trends every year and what these are all about.
Yeah, well, we start living in the future, as I like to think about it, around summertime. We gather our analysts together to brainstorm what's happening, what they think is going to come next across all different markets and categories. We collaborate with our consumer trends team, with our beauty and personal care team, our packaging team, our household team, just to make sure we're getting the broad scope of what consumers are looking for and what we think is ahead, as well as the macro trends that probably will influence the next year or so. And this year, we actually decided to take an interesting look and face head on the fact that we know that consumers behave in contradictory ways. So we wanted to explore some of these opposites and complexities and dichotomies within consumer behavior and really recognize that there's not really a straight line in between how consumers are making their choices, that they can say they want health, but they also want indulgence, and they might say they want local, but they also are open to global. And there's all these kind of confusing things that our clients have to deal with and navigate between what consumers say and what they do.
Great. And they're global in scope, but they're very different from one part of the world to another, aren't they?
Yes.
So I would say we've got four big trends. We're going to talk just a little bit about each of them, what we see going on out there in the marketplace, what brands can do, how things might be different from one part of the world to another. So for those listening in, I'm going to name the four trends. I'm not going to explain them because we'll talk through each one. We're going to start with fundamentally nutritious, then talk about rule rebellion. The next one is chain reaction, and our last one is hybrid harvests. So to kick us off then, fundamentally nutrition. That could be about food as medicine, but it's very different now than it used to be, isn't it?
It is. It's something that we're seeing in some parts of the world. I'll highlight, definitely not everywhere, but GLP-1 prescription drugs that are actual medicines that people are taking to change their approach to their diets are changing the way that consumers might be thinking about what's important in their diets. For food as medicine, traditionally, especially if we look back to traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine, there's all these functional ingredients that people can use in their diets to get certain, efficacies. Now what we're seeing when we introduce these medicines is that people are looking more at the nutrition levels, those basics. So how much protein are they getting in their day? How much fiber? Are they getting the vitamins and minerals? And really paring things back to the basics before we add on those different functionalities and getting into those emerging ingredients like adaptogens and nootropics. It's really about making sure that we're getting what we need on a daily basis in those fundamentally nutritious recommendations.
So that's really then kind of gone back to where we were before to a certain degree in talking about, as you said, talking about the basics. And to me, that feels like that's something that's truly universal, that we see everywhere to one degree or another.
And I think that's where a lot of the world outside North America still is with this trend. I think it's still much more about that kind of back to basics approach. There's lots of talk in many markets, of course, about weight loss drugs, but in most cases they're not really in widespread use yet. They're not really fully approved yet, so they're not widely available. what we see is that continuation of that fundamental nutrition trend where it really comes down to consumers paying a bit more attention to the basics and perhaps giving a little bit less consideration to some of the slightly more faddy elements that have been popularized over the last couple of years, largely by social media sources and influencers, it's fair to say. So people are kind of just a little bit of a trust issue perhaps around some of those, and they're turning back to the good old-fashioned basic stuff. How many fruits and vegetables am I actually consuming? The days of 5 portions a day have long gone now. People talk about 30 different plants a day, things like that, which is perfectly achievable if you put some sense into it. But there's lots of discussion around that. That's really what I think it's about, perhaps for many markets outside North America.
I think it also intersects really well with the debate we've seen grow over the past couple of years around highly processed or ultra processed foods. And really, again, going back to the basics of what are these ingredients? Can I recognize them? And is this something that's going to benefit me? And especially as we deal with so many markets being mired in cost of living crises, you're getting the value for the food that you're buying through that efficacy versus maybe taking a risk on a new ingredient you don't necessarily know. Yes, you want relaxation, but you don't know if it's going to work as much as you're going to feel full from fiber and protein.
Yep. Simple and value driven. There's some out that way.
Yeah. Although, Jenny, to your point about opposites and complexities and everything being all mixed up, it feels like there still is a place for those functional ingredients, the adaptogens and the nootropics and all of the others out there, but that perhaps, if I'm reading this correctly, perhaps there's a place for all of those things, but food and beverage companies, make sure you nail those basics first.
Yeah, and recognize that the staples of people's diets are going to be those fundamentally nutritious things, and those other indulgences maybe, or luxuries or things that we're going to have on occasion might be more of those functionalities. It's not probably part of people's everyday routine.
Mm-hmm. Well, the second trend that we've got, I think, follows on beautifully. Obviously, you have them in this order for a reason. But talking about those opposites and dichotomies, I think rule rebellion is really what this one is all about, isn't it?
Yes, rule rebellion is more on that indulgent side. It's recognizing that consumers are embracing being perfectly imperfect beings, and they love the idea of breaking the rules sometimes when it comes to food and drink. And they're excited about mashups and eating breakfast for dinner and all of these other things. And I think it actually complements fundamentally nutritious in a really interesting way, where when you know that you've gotten the basics, you give yourself more of that leeway for those little treats, or maybe the big treats. There's so much more that we've been talking about since the pandemic of, I've earned this, I deserve this, and I'm not going to think about whether this is what I should quote unquote have in my daily diet. It's just what feels good, what tastes good, what's fun, and we need that in our lives with so much stress and anxiety and uncertainty.
Yeah, I think there's a really nice point made in the deck actually around the trends around this concept of the health isn't always aspirational. And I think that was quite insightful when I read that. I thought that one through and thought, yeah, for so long we've talked about health as a key driver. And of course it still is. It still is very much a key driver. But it's not always aspirational. It's getting the idea that actually if that's a fundamental, then what's the aspirational part on top of it? It's a little bit of a refocus, isn't it? I think that gives brands some really interesting places to play in unguilty pleasures.
One of my favorite recommendations with this is to explore the unexplored and look at different categories and think about how you could cross over with fashion brands or with beauty brands. My favorite example that we have is from a Japanese company that partnered with a rubber band company for gummy candies. So just something to emphasize how stretchy these gummy candies are, which isn't the reason why you necessarily buy a gummy candy. You don't need to stretch it, but it's encouraging you to play with your food and have a bit more fun, and maybe think about that rubber band company in a new way. In a paperless society, who knows how long that rubber band company might be around, but maybe this is security for them. But it's really just having fun, breaking those boundaries. Consumers don't see those lines as much as we might think about in the industry, and being creative really gets that response these days.
Yeah. We've always said, I think, haven't we, that the retail industry in particular thinks very much in terms of categories, because it needs to understand which shelf to put something on. But consumers don't really think like that. They think, what's my need at this particular moment, occasion? What's going to suit me right now? And they might end up looking at a particular aisle or a particular category in a supermarket, but it's more by chance than by design often. So I think we've got to encourage brands to break out of that rigid category focus and think about disrupting it a little bit, playing with it. The retail trade will work with it. I mean, I have to, especially taking them on the journey.
Yeah. I think the data that we see, especially in the U.S., about number of times people snack a day and how that has changed so much over time, where Dave, if I recall, you and I did a presentation one time years ago, and we talked about snacking, looking back at our data in the very beginning. So probably early 2000, very early 2000s, where consumers were super snackers, were consumers who snacked like 5 or more times a week.
Yeah.
And now the data is 5 or more times a day are the super snackers. So I think that too really fits into that whole idea of rural rebellion. It's not only breakfast for dinner, but it's a snack that's lunch, or many snacks and no actual meal that makes any kind of sense, or girl dinner, or whatever it is that we see out there. So it's funny. The other thing that comes to mind to me when you talked about the gummy candy and the rubber band company is the little trend that we're seeing in the U.S. of freeze-dried unexpected things. Mm-hmm. So there's a company that has a line of freeze-dried snacks, and one of them is essentially like a gummy peach ring, that classic peach-flavored gummy candy, but freeze-dried. So it is light and airy and crunchy, and it tastes exactly like the gummy candy that it's imitating, which, again, just takes everything and turns it on its head, because it's an unexpected texture, but it's a flavor that you know. So another little bit of rural rebellion there, I think.
Yeah.
So number 3 then is a little bit different. Number 3 is chain reaction. So Jenny, tell us a little bit about this one and what it's all about.
Yeah, this one is an interesting one. Our final 2 trends came really out of our European division, where we're seeing a lot more conversations about where food is coming from and understanding more of that supply chain and shoring up the supply chain. So chain reaction looks at how disruptions to the food supply are becoming more frequent. So the need for the industry to encourage consumers to accept and to trust new origins, ingredients, and flavors that will emerge both locally and globally. So this is kind of something that we might have remembered from the early lockdown periods where you couldn't get your hands on certain things. But now, because of climate change or geopolitical tensions, all of these other factors, we can't necessarily uphold the preferences we've always had. We can't say that we want to buy local all the time, because that gets more difficult or more expensive. And so it's recognizing that we're going to have to encourage consumers to be open to changing some of these preferences, and maybe even to get excited about some of these alternatives or substitutes, versus having to be like, oh, we have to settle for this because this is the only thing we can get our hands on.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think a lot of the impetus for this one came out of the European team. I think it's difficult to really pin down some really strong examples of it happening yet, but there's a lot of conversation about it. And when you see headlines in French newspapers about the fact that the baguette is under threat, or in Italian newspapers that the cost of espresso is going to go so high that they'll have to change the law to cover it, things like that. And British beer might be threatened. People start to panic. So I think there's a lot of talk about this. I think in terms of real action, I think it's quite hard to find it right now, but it's coming. It's surely coming, because it's down to climate change, yes, but I think increasingly it's just down to the difficulties of trading. With the situation in the Ukraine and with the situation with the UK, for example, being out of the European Union now, trading situations for many markets have changed substantially. And it's just not as easy or as cheap to get hold of some of the ingredients that we always relied on. So things have begun to change over time, but at the moment we're just substituting one source for another. So it's largely a question of sourcing. I think actual substitution is very much the next step.
I think too there's substitution that will be coming that will be because of climate change in a few key categories like chocolate, coffee is another one too. So it feels like that's a challenge for R&D and for the scientific community to come up with what those alternatives could be. Especially thinking of those two ingredients, orange juice being another one, especially for the U.S. market and the impact there with crop failures and all of that.
And I think it will become a real issue around how that's communicated as well, because I think in chocolate, for example, what we'll see is probably the actual percentage of cocoa in the product will decline, but the flavour will be enhanced, improved, changed in a way that consumers will probably not really notice. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. There are different ways of enhancing the chocolatey flavour of a product with sugars and other ingredients and so on, as well as texture and mouthfeel and size and all those other factors. So you'll see a bit of a shift to compensate for that reduction in cocoa mass, for example. And probably the same thing with orange juice. I mean, ultimately, you'll see the same thing.
Yes.
You'll see apple juice being substituted increasingly for orange juice, but then something else being added to, and how much of that will be honestly communicated and openly communicated, because that could set up some really interesting challenges for the industry somewhere down the line. The next kind of shrinkflation, potentially.
I think that's also the challenge in terms of communication. To me, I think there's really interesting lessons we can look at from the plant-based category of how are you positioning something as a substitute versus an alternative, and emphasizing that these are things that taste different. I'm thinking, especially if we look at the parallels to non-dairy milk. People have really embraced non-dairy milk for that texture, for that flavor, for that mouthfeel. They don't necessarily see it as a full-on substitute for or something that they have to trade away from dairy milk. And I think for these chocolate substitutes, for these coffee substitutes, even olive oils and juices, as we're saying, there's a really interesting way, and it's going to be kind of an alchemy. It's going to be a science to explain that to consumers, but we could really position that as something that is going to taste better or different. It's not meant to be a sad substitute for a product that you've grown up and loved and know, and sadly that's going away because of climate change or geopolitical tensions or these things we don't really want to grasp.
Yeah, exactly. I could also see with, especially with thinking really specifically of orange juice, there being, Jenny, to your point when you were first talking about this trend, that there will be a real push towards more blends, so orange and something else, and also a very strong push towards exploration of other types of citrus, other types of fruits, maybe not to replace orange juice, but to be something else for consumers to have in their fridges or pantries to give a try to. You can see that happening with coffee as well, like with mushroom coffee, which is mushroom and coffee for a different reason, not because of coffee issues, but but you can see that there are some blends out there beginning to happen just a little bit. So.
Yeah, there's also beanless coffee brands like Atomo and Choviva, which is an oat and sunflower seed replacement for chocolate. So I think those brands are really pioneering what that could look like and why they like that proposition could work and how to explain that to consumers in a way to get them to be interested in this beyond just a price parity.
Exactly. That also makes me think of Notco and the technology that Notco uses, using AI to help create the perfect formula for something that isn't a dairy milk but tastes like a dairy milk. You would think that those kinds of technologies in the future will help the industry create things to substitute for some of the flavors we like so much. Although I don't know what the heck that we could do to help the French with their baguettes and the Italians with their coffee and the English with their beer, though. That's a bit of a challenge, I think. So, yeah. So drink it while you can. So the last one then, I think we've actually talked about some of the big picture concepts around this last one, is called hybrid harvests. So talk about that a little bit, Jenny.
Yeah, Lynn, your example of Notco really transitions into this trend well, because Notco has for years talked about their AI database. I believe his name is Giuseppe, that helps them identify those plant-based substitutes. But Hybrid Harvest is looking at how food and drink companies can demonstrate how technology and agriculture will work together to benefit consumers, farmers, and the environment. And much like we just talked about with chain reaction, there is a consumer perception we have to overcome. And a lot of this is related to the fact that we want nature and technology to be separated. And we get worried when those two lines meet. But much like our regular lives, where we've recognized the conveniences and efficiencies that technology can bring us, there are a lot of benefits that technology can bring to how food and drink is made. We just have to explain that to consumers in a way that showcases that we're not sidelining farmers, we're not, over bringing robots into the production process, and this is done in a trustworthy manner that benefits all parties.
Yeah, I think I can only emphasise the importance of that communication, that transparency. I think that's really something what this is really about. It's always happened. It's just that it's got really bad press. I mean, we don't want to talk about GM foods again, but that misfired terribly in many parts of the world because consumers were never told what the benefit is. What's the point of this? Are you just playing around with it for the sake of it, or to boost profits, or is there actually a real reason behind it? And it wasn't ever really explained. So I think we can get it right this time round. We can actually communicate the benefits to consumers, and brands can act as that bridge between the consumer and the producer, which I don't think they did very well last time. They just kind of said, we're not going to do anything. We don't want anything to do with it. They backed away from it. And I think we need a more positive approach, a bit more engaged, a bit more proactive, and act as a proper bridge between the two sides effectively. We shouldn't be against each other. They should be able to work with each other and think with each other to come up with some smart solutions.
I was just going to emphasize that consumers are becoming open to that. David, your point about GM and genetic modification, that was something that was an absolute no-go. But our data on fruits and vegetables, especially in the US, is showcasing that consumers are open to this if it's meaning that the fruit is more nutritious or if it's tastier. For example, 49% of US fruit buyers would eat fruit engineered to be tastier, and 52% would eat fruit engineered to be more nutritious. So it has to be that clear benefit to them. And that goes back to our fundamentally nutritious trend, really wanting to know that you're getting that value from what you're purchasing.
Good point. Very good.
I think one of the other things about value as well that links to this is how long the perishable products especially stay fresh, and the role that the genetic modification has played in that. But that makes me think of another one of these issues that was also handled very, very badly, and that is irradiation. and all the benefits that irradiation can provide in so many categories, but how that did not go over with consumers at all. Dave, I don't know if you recall. I've forgotten when it was renamed. At one point, they attempted to rename it, and I know in the U.S. they were actively pushing a line of tomatoes that had been irradiated and therefore had a much longer shelf life. That goes way back. That's got to be 20 years now.
I'm old enough to remember it, but I can't tell you when it was exactly. Yeah.
No, I can't either. But I do remember at the time that it was even worse than GMOs. The reaction was even worse than GMOs because it was the word. It was the word that was just so wrong. So I think to your point of transparency and communication and brands like getting behind what it is and what the benefits are and being able to talk about those benefits, I think is absolutely essential. Mm-hmm. A question about this particular trend. I mean, we've talked off and on just a little bit in some of these trends about sustainability, but this is really where sustainability does play a very big role, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's taking a modern look at how we can make things more sustainable and, recognizing that technology can bring those efficiencies that help us know where we should water and when we should water a field versus just using precious water resources to soak in kind of maybe a more traditional irrigation type of way.
Yeah. When it comes time next year, where do you think these trends will be? What will we be talking about? I know it's not summer yet, so it's way too early. But thinking about these 4 trends, how do you think they're going to progress in this coming year?
I think David made it a really great point that I think we're feeling, at least in the U.S. now in January, is the geopolitical tensions when it comes to chain reaction. And I think this is going to be a really pivotal year for what are those things that consumers have to recognize are going to be scarce or going to cost more, or you have to accept those substitutes. So I think that trend, especially from where we were when we were developing this, I thought this was going to be farther off. It's really hitting a pivot point right now that this is not something that consumers can shy away from. It's going to be something that there's going to be a lot more categories, a lot more foods that we probably absolutely love and rely on that we're going to have to learn to adapt to or pay more for or only buy in season. There's a lot of maybe trade-offs we're going to have to make there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that feels like the biggest change that we'll see in the shorter term. I agree. I think some of the other trends will be, they're going to continue. They're just going to roll on. I mean, I think, when we looked at fundamentally nutritious, we set the context of the historic trend there where we talked about the trends that we reported before that fed into it and how that had helped the trend now evolve from things like, I'm trying to think what we called them now. Well, back to, the savvy sustenance around the consumer around the economic downturn, looking for value and simplicity, and how that is reflected to some extent now in the fundamentally nutritious trend. So it's not like it's a new trend. None of these are really brand new, are they? They're all a continuation of something that's gone before it. So it's just a question of what comes to the fore first, I guess.
Well, any final comments from any of you, from either of you? I think we can talk about this, what we think is going to happen and what has happened for quite a bit longer. But is there anything else that you want to make sure the listeners really know about or really think about?
I think I'm still really excited about the possibilities for rural rebellion. I think that, especially at a time when we're seeing less product innovation releases, really gives an opportunity to think about what can we make new but familiar, and what can we make exciting from parts that consumers are not entirely new to, and really embracing some of those creative aspects of product development that maybe have been tempered a little bit for the past few years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think from my side, I'd just bring it back to what the trends are really all about, which is that inconsistencies in human behavior. or the apparent inconsistencies, the contradictory behaviours, indulgence versus health, and fresh and local, but also global, and all the influences that come to play. And just, I think, just rethinking that through a little bit in today's world, because it's not the same as it was last year or the year before, and how that's potentially changing, and what that really means for consumers on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, for me, as I was listening to both of you talk, I jotted down a couple words that seem to really sum up what this whole conversation has been about. So what I wrote down was, you've got to nail the fundamentals, but you need to have some fun. You need to stay flexible, and you have to be as transparent as you possibly can. But as you know, and as all of our listeners know, this isn't the end of the conversation. You can subscribe to the Little Conversation wherever you happen to get your podcasts. Also, you can go to the Mintel site, mintel.com, and get more information there. So I want to thank the two of you for this great conversation about the trends that we see in food and drink for 2025. And for all of you listening in, thank you, and see you on the next Little Conversation.